The atmosphere inside the Cook County courtroom was suffocating, heavy with the scent of floor wax and old wood, but mostly it smelled of money. Richard Sterling sat in the witness stand, adjusting the cuffs of his $3,000 suit. He looked every bit the master of the universe he claimed to be. He was the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, a man who moved markets with a whisper, and today, he was moving to crush the one person who had ever dared to defy him, his wife, Elena. Across the aisle, Elena sat with her head bowed, her hands clasping a frayed folder on the table. She looked small, almost invisible next to her court-appointed attorney, a man named Mr. Davis, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week and was wearing a suit 2 sizes too big. To anyone watching, the outcome was already decided. It wasn't a trial. It was a slaughter. Richard's lawyer, a high-priced shark named Marcus Vance from one of Chicago's top firms, paced in front of the stand. Vance had a reputation for destroying lives, and he was currently dissecting Elena's character with surgical precision. Vance stopped and turned to the judge, a stern man named Judge Patterson, who had been looking at his watch for the last 10 minutes. Vance asked Richard to describe the events of the night in question. The night Richard claimed Elena had proven herself an unfit mother and an unstable partner. Richard cleared his throat, putting on his best performance of the aggrieved, long-suffering husband. He spoke about how hard he worked, how he had built his empire from nothing, and how Elena had simply been unable to cope with the pressure of their lifestyle. He painted a picture of a woman who was hysterical, financially irresponsible, and frankly, a liability to his business and their children. Elena remained silent, though every word felt like a physical blow. She knew the truth. She knew that Richard's empire was built on shadows and intimidation, that his hard work often involved aggressive takeovers and questionable accounting. But she had no proof. Richard had been meticulous. He had cut her off from their joint accounts 6 months ago, drained her personal savings through legal fees, and isolated her from their friends. She was alone. The gallery was packed with reporters, all hungry for the details of the Sterling divorce. Richard had leaked stories to the press for weeks, painting Elena as a gold digger who had trapped a billionaire and was now trying to cash out. The public narrative was set. She was the villain. He was the hero. Judge Patterson leaned forward, looking over his spectacles at Elena's table. He asked Mr. Davis if he had any cross-examination. Elena's lawyer stood up shakily, shuffling his papers. He asked a few weak questions about Richard's travel schedule, trying to imply he was never home, but Richard deflected them with ease. Richard smiled aggressively, a predator playing with its food. He explained that his travel was necessary to provide the luxurious life Elena had enjoyed for so long. He twisted the knife, mentioning that while he was closing deals in Tokyo and London, Elena was allegedly neglecting their domestic responsibilities. The judge nodded sympathetically. It was clear he respected Richard. Richard was a pillar of the community, a donor to the police fund, a man of status. Elena was nobody. Richard looked directly at Elena then, a cold smirk touching his lips that only she could see. It was a look of absolute triumph. He had won. He was going to take the house, full custody of the twins, and leave her with nothing but her maiden name and a ruined reputation. He had told her this would happen. On the night she finally packed a bag to leave, he had blocked the doorway, looming over her, and whispered that if she walked out, he would make sure she never saw a dime or her children again. He was making good on that promise. The arrogance radiating off him was palpable. He felt untouchable. He owned the room, he owned the narrative, and soon he would own her future. Mr. Vance stood up to deliver what was essentially a closing statement disguised as a procedural motion. He requested that the court immediately grant temporary sole custody to Richard Sterling, citing Elena's lack of stable housing and income. It was a brutal move, intended to break her spirit completely before the trial even technically concluded. The judge seemed inclined to agree. He began to speak, his voice resonating through the courtroom, talking about the best interests of the children and the stability that a father like Mr. Sterling could provide. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, hot and stinging. She gripped the table so hard her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to tell them all that Richard was a monster behind closed doors. But she knew how she would look, hysterical, just as he claimed. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, jarring thud. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room, interrupting Judge Patterson mid-sentence. Heads turned. The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his belt, ready to admonish whoever had interrupted the proceedings. Richard turned in the witness stand, annoyed. He expected a reporter, or perhaps a confused intern. Instead, a woman walked in. She was older, perhaps in her early 60s, wearing a simple, unassuming gray wool coat that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried a large, worn leather tote bag. She walked with a cane, tapping it rhythmically against the floor tiles. Click, click, click. The sound cut through the silence. To the casual observer, she looked like a grandmother who had wandered into the wrong room, perhaps looking for traffic court. Richard squinted. He recognized her, but it took him a moment. It was Elena's mother, Martha. He nearly laughed out loud. Martha had always been a non-entity to him. She lived in a small town in Ohio, a retired librarian who sent knitted sweaters for birthdays and called once a week. Richard had banned her from their estate 3 years ago because he found her provincial and annoying. He hadn't seen her since. What was she doing here? Did she think she could plead for mercy? Richard's annoyance turned to amusement. This was pathetic. Elena had called in the cavalry, and the cavalry was a pensioner with a cane. Vance, Richard's lawyer, stood up, buttoning his jacket. He addressed the judge, stating that this was highly irregular and asking for the spectator to be removed if she was going to cause a disturbance. The judge looked irritated. He asked the woman to identify herself and take a seat in the gallery immediately or face contempt. Martha didn't stop walking. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Elena, who was staring at her mother in shock, tears streaming down her face. Martha looked straight at Richard. Her eyes were hard, devoid of the warmth he remembered from years ago. There was a steeliness in her gaze that made the hair on the back of Richard's neck stand up, though he didn't understand why. She stopped at the railing, the wooden barrier separating the public from the legal arena. The bailiff moved to intercept her, but she raised a hand, not in surrender, but in a command to wait. She reached into her worn tote bag. Richard watched, expecting a tissue or a Bible. Instead, she pulled out a thick, bound document with a blue cover. It wasn't just any document. Richard's eyes narrowed. He recognized the specific shade of blue cardstock. It was the color used by the International Banking Commission for high-level audit trails, a color he hadn't seen since his days dealing with offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, companies he had assured everyone were closed years ago. Martha didn't say a word to the bailiff or the judge. She simply slid the heavy blue folder across the scarred defense table toward Elena's stunned public defender. The sound of the dense paper hitting the wood was the only noise in the cavernous room, echoing like a gunshot. Judge Patterson banged his gavel, his face flushing with anger at the breach of protocol. "Madam, step away from the bench immediately, or you will be escorted out in handcuffs," he barked, his patience finally snapping. Richard chuckled from the stand, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, I apologize for my mother-in-law. She's confused. Perhaps a mental health evaluation is in order along with her removal." Before the judge could process the absurdity of a retired librarian claiming to be a stakeholder in a billion-dollar tech empire, the heavy courtroom doors swung open again. This time there was no hesitation. 6 men and women in immaculate charcoal bespoke suits marched in, moving with the synchronized precision of a military unit. The air in the room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping a few degrees. These weren't local Chicago divorce attorneys. These were apex predators from the top tier of corporate law, the kind of lawyers who billed more in an hour than Mr. Davis made in a month. They carried leather briefcases embossed with gold lettering and projected an aura of absolute authority. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time as he recognized the lead attorney, Silas Thorne. The arrival of the legal team sucked the oxygen out of the room. Even Judge Patterson sat up straighter, instinctively adjusting his robe. Silas Thorne didn't acknowledge Richard or his high-priced lawyer, Marcus Vance. He walked directly to Martha, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect that sent a shockwave through the gallery of reporters. He took the empty seat beside Elena, while his associates began setting up sleek laptops and stacking bankers' boxes on the defense table with practiced efficiency. Mr. Davis, Elena's exhausted lawyer, Looked like he had just been handed a winning lottery ticket and a live grenade at the same time. Richard gripped the railing of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. The dynamic had shifted violently. Silas Thorne stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked only at the judge. "Your Honor, Silas Thorne, representing the Sovereign Heritage Trust, acting on behalf of the intervener, Mrs. Martha Sovrano," he announced, his voice smooth as velvet, but hard as iron. "We are filing an emergency motion to stay these proceedings immediately based on the discovery of massive fraudulent conveyance and breach of fiduciary duty by the plaintiff, Richard Sterling." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Vance, Richard's lawyer, jumped up. "Objection! This is a divorce hearing, not a corporate tribunal. Who is the Sovereign Heritage Trust?" Thorne turned to Vance and smiled coldly. "The Sovereign Heritage Trust is the majority shareholder of Sterling Dynamics, and your client is merely an employee we are in the process of terminating for cause." Elena stared at her mother, her mouth slightly open, her mind reeling. Martha reached out and squeezed Elena's hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her face remaining stoic. "I promised your father I would protect you," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough for Elena to hear. "We let him think he was the king as long as he treated you right, but he broke the contract." The revelation hit Elena like a physical weight. Her father had been a quiet man, a watchmaker in Ohio. She never knew about trusts or heritage funds, but as Thorne handed a thick stack of documents to the bailiff, the reality began to sink in. Richard hadn't built his empire on his own. He had been funded, he had been watched, and he was living on borrowed time. Richard's face went from pale to a mottled red. He stood up in the witness box, pointing a shaking finger at Thorne. "That's a lie!" he shouted, forgetting the microphone. "I built this company from the ground up. I own 51% of the voting shares. This is insane." Judge Patterson slammed the gavel, but he was reading the documents Thorne had submitted with wide eyes. Thorne waited for the noise to subside before delivering the next blow. "Mr. Sterling, your initial seed capital was provided by the trust under a strict vesting schedule," Thorne said, pointing to the document. "It included a moral turpitude clause, Section 4, Paragraph B. In the event of infidelity or financial abuse, all unvested shares revert immediately to the trust." Richard laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that scraped against the silence of the courtroom. "This is a fabrication," he spat, leaning over the railing. "My shares are protected in a holding company in Nevis. You can't touch them." But Marcus Vance wasn't laughing. The high-priced attorney was furiously scanning the addendum Thorne had provided. Vance's face had drained of color. He looked at Richard with the eyes of a man realizing he was standing on the deck of the Titanic after the iceberg hit. "Richard," Vance whispered, his voice cracking, "did you sign the 2009 recapitalization agreement without reading the appendix?" Richard froze. He had. He had been too busy celebrating his first million to read the fine print. Thorne didn't let the moment breathe. "Mr. Sterling, regarding your Nevis holding company," he said, pulling a sleek tablet from his briefcase and tapping the screen. "We triggered the clawback provision at 8:45 a.m. Your offshore accounts have been flagged for money laundering review by the SEC and the IRS based on irregularities found in the audit." Thorne turned the tablet around. It showed a live feed of Sterling Dynamics stock plummeting, with a news ticker running across the bottom. "CEO investigation launched. The board has convened an emergency meeting. You have been removed as chairman, effective immediately." The digital walls were closing in, dismantling his identity piece by piece in real time. Richard grabbed his smartphone, his thumbs swiping frantically across the glass. He needed to call his contacts in D.C., his fixer, anyone, but the screen was dead black. "My phone," he muttered, shaking it violently. "It's bricked." Thorne nodded politely. "Company property, Mr. Sterling. Remote wipe protocol is standard procedure for terminated executives under investigation for embezzlement." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporters were typing furiously on their laptops. Richard looked out the window toward the parking lot where his driver waited in the Bentley. He saw a tow truck backing up to his prized vehicle. 2 uniformed officers were standing by the driver's door, writing a ticket. The courtroom doors opened again, but this time it wasn't a lawyer. It was Greg Miller, Richard's CFO and oldest friend. the man who knew where all the bodies were buried. Richard's eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Greg," he shouted, tell them this is insanity." Greg didn't look at Richard. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table, keeping his eyes on the floor, and handed a thick stack of hard drives to Silas Thorne. "It's all there," Greg said quietly, his voice trembling. "The dual ledgers, the bribe payments for the zoning permits in Miami, the hidden accounts for his mistress." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. His best friend had turned state's witness to save his own skin. The betrayal severed Richard's last tether to reality. He scrambled out of the witness box, ignoring the bailiff's shout. "You traitor!" he screamed, lunging toward Greg. 2 court security officers intercepted him instantly, grabbing him by the arms. For a man who prided himself on his dignity and control, the image of him being restrained like a common brawler was devastating. Flashbulbs popped from the gallery. Reporters were now openly taking photos, ignoring the judge's previous bans. Richard Sterling, the untouchable titan of industry, was being manhandled in a cheap suit, his face twisted in impotent rage, while his wife watched in silence. Elena watched the chaos unfold with a strange sense of detachment. For years, Richard had made her feel small, convincing her she was crazy for questioning his spending or his late nights. Now, seeing him unravel so completely, she didn't feel triumph. She felt relief. Martha placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Look at him, Ellie," Martha said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's just a man, a small, greedy man who forgot where he came from." Elena looked up at her mother. The gray cardigan and the cane were just camouflage. Beneath it, Martha was a fortress. The fear that had defined Elena's life for a decade began to evaporate, replaced by a budding sense of strength. Judge Patterson banged his gavel with such force that the handle cracked. "Order! Order in this court!" he bellowed. The officers forced Richard back into his chair. The judge glared at Vance. "Counselor, your client is dangerously close to spending the night in a cell for contempt, regardless of his financial status, which, it appears, is rapidly deteriorating." Patterson turned his gaze to Thorne. "Mr. Thorne, these allegations of embezzlement and bribery, are they substantiated?" Thorne handed up the hard drives Greg had delivered. "Fully, Your Honor. We have also forwarded copies to the district attorney's office. We expect an indictment before lunch." Richard sat panting, his tie askew, his hair mussed. He looked around the room, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He realized the civil trial was the least of his worries now. Prison was on the table. He needed to get out. He needed to get to his private jet at O'Hare. He stood up slowly, trying to regain some composure, smoothing his jacket. I need a recess," he stammered, his voice weak. "For medical reasons." He turned toward the side exit, calculating the distance. But as he took a step, the side door opened. A U.S. Marshal stood there, arms crossed, blocking the path. The trap was sealed. There was nowhere left to run. Richard made one final, desperate attempt to control the narrative. He turned his back on the judge and faced the gallery of reporters, his eyes wide and manic. "This is a corporate coup," he bellowed, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "They are weaponizing the family court system to steal my intellectual property. My wife is a pawn in a hostile takeover orchestrated by a bitter old woman." He looked directly into the lens of a local news camera, putting on the performance of his life. "I am the victim here. I am the job creator. They are trying to destroy an American success story because they are jealous." For a fleeting second, the sheer conviction in his voice made a few reporters pause, pens hovering over their notepads. He was charismatic, even in his ruin. Elena sat perfectly still. A week ago, this display would have crumbled her. She would have tried to defend herself, to scream that he was lying, which would have only made her look unstable. But today, she didn't move. She didn't even blink. She watched him flail with a cold, clinical detachment. Silas Thorne leaned over and whispered, "Let him finish. He is digging his own grave with every word." Martha patted Elena's hand, her expression serene. The public manipulation attempt was failing because the audience had already seen the man behind the curtain. Richard wasn't a titan anymore. He was a cornered rat baring its teeth. The silence from the defense table was louder than Richard's shouting. Thorne waited until Richard ran out of breath before standing up slowly. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "To address Mr. Sterling's claims of victimhood, we have one final piece of evidence. This was recovered from the distinct server cloud of Mr. Sterling's personal assistant, who is currently cooperating with the FBI. Thorne held up a small flash drive. Exhibit G, a voice memo recorded 3 days ago in the master suite of the Sterling estate. Judge Patterson, looking thoroughly done with Richard's antics, nodded. "Play it, Counselor." The audio system crackled to life, and Richard's face went the color of ash. The recording was crystal clear. It was Richard's voice, unmistakable in its arrogance. "I don't care what it costs, Greg. Plant the drugs in her car before the custody hearing on Tuesday. I want a baggie of coke under the driver's seat. Once the cops find that, she loses the twins forever, and I don't have to pay a cent in alimony." The voice on the recording laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "She's too stupid to check. We'll say she relapsed. The judge will eat it up." The silence that followed the recording was absolute. The court reporter stopped typing. The gallery was frozen in horror. It wasn't just financial fraud, it was a calculated conspiracy to frame the mother of his children. Judge Patterson's face turned a deep, furious crimson. He slowly removed his glasses and set them on the bench. He looked at Richard, not as a judge looks at a litigant, but as a human being looks at a monster. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "In 30 years on the bench, I have never heard such a vile abuse of power." Richard stammered, It's deep fake. AI. It's not me." But no one was listening. The moral destruction was complete. The titan of industry facade had been stripped away to reveal a petty, vindictive criminal who would destroy his own family for money. Thorne delivered the final legal blow. "Based on this evidence of conspiracy to commit a felony against the beneficiary, we are invoking the bad actor clause of the trust immediately." Thorne didn't even look at Richard. "This nullifies Mr. Sterling's golden parachute and his severance package. Furthermore, the trust is suing for full restitution of all marital funds spent on his legal defense today." Thorne turned to Marcus Vance. "Mr. Vance, unless you wish to be named as a co-conspirator in a RICO case, I suggest you step away." Vance didn't hesitate. He began packing his briefcase with frantic speed. "I'm withdrawing as counsel, Your Honor," Vance mumbled, avoiding Richard's gaze. Richard stood alone in the center of the courtroom. His lawyer was gone. His friends had turned on him. His money was frozen. The security guards he had once paid to intimidate others were now blocking his exit. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was going to prison. Not a country club prison, but a real one. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide and pleading for the first time. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Ellie, please. Think of the kids. Don't let them take me." It was a pathetic sight. The man who had felt untouchable an hour ago was now begging the woman he had tried to destroy for salvation she couldn't give. Judge Patterson didn't wait for a response. "Bailiff, take Mr. Sterling into custody immediately. He is a flight risk and a danger to the public." The U.S. Marshals moved in. They didn't use velvet gloves. They spun Richard around, pulling his arms behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the final period on his sentence. "You can't do this! I'm Richard Sterling!" he screamed as they frog-marched him toward the side door. "I know the governor!" As the heavy door slammed shut behind him, the courtroom exhaled. The tension broke. Elena let out a long, shaky breath, burying her face in her hands. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. 6 months later, the name Sterling Dynamics had been scrubbed from the skyscraper in downtown Chicago. It was now the headquarters of the Sovrano Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal aid for victims of domestic financial abuse. Elena stood in what used to be Richard's corner office. The heavy mahogany desk and the intimidating leather chair were gone, replaced by a simple, modern workspace filled with light. The walls, once adorned with portraits of Richard shaking hands with politicians, now featured artwork created by children in the Foundation's program. Elena looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She didn't even feel like a survivor. She felt like a builder. Her mother, Martha, sat on a comfortable sofa in the corner, knitting a yellow scarf. The cane rested against the armrest. Martha had moved to Chicago to be closer to the twins, who were thriving now that the toxic tension in the house had dissolved. "You have a meeting with the board in 10 minutes, Ellie," Martha said, not looking up from her needles. Elena smiled. "I know, Mom. I'm just thinking." She walked over and sat beside her mother. "I still can't believe you kept it all a secret." "The trust, the money, everything." Martha paused her knitting. "Power is heavy, Elena. Your father and I wanted you to build a life on love, not leverage. We only stepped in when the leverage was used against you." Richard was currently serving year 1 of a 15-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in Terre Haute. The plea deal had been harsh, but the evidence was overwhelming. He had lost everything: his reputation, his assets, and his freedom. He wrote letters occasionally, blaming his lawyers, blaming the economy, blaming everyone but himself. Elena never opened them. She had learned the most important lesson of all. You cannot reason with a narcissist. You can only remove their access to you. She had set firm boundaries. The children would know their father when they were old enough to understand the truth, but until then, they were protected. The resolution of the legal battle had been swift and total. The forensic audit revealed that Richard had been siphoning money for years to support a gambling habit and bad real estate investments. The Sovereign Heritage Trust had recovered most of the assets, which were now placed in a new trust for Elena's children. Elena had taken a position as the director of the foundation, using her experience to help women who were in the same position she had been, trapped by partners who used money as a weapon. She was no longer the unstable housewife Richard had painted her as. She was a respected advocate, a voice for the voiceless. The epilogue of her life was just beginning. She walked out of the office and down the hall to the conference room. The staff greeted her with genuine warmth, not the fearful deference they had shown Richard. Silas Thorne was there, acting as legal counsel for the foundation. He nodded at her, a small smile of pride on his face. He had seen the transformation firsthand. The terrified woman in the courtroom had been forged into a leader. Elena took her seat at the head of the table. She opened her folder, a simple blue one, just like her mother's, and began the meeting. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice steady and strong. The story of Richard Sterling became a cautionary tale in Chicago's business schools, a case study in hubris. But the story of Elena became something else, a legend of resilience. It was a reminder that power doesn't always look like a loud man in an expensive suit. Sometimes, power looks like a quiet grandmother with a knitting bag, or a mother who refuses to give up on her children. It was a reminder that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it under legal threats and NDAs. And most importantly, it was proof that dignity is a currency that never devalues. As the meeting wrapped up, Elena's phone buzzed. It wasn't a threatening text from Richard or a demand from a lawyer. It was a picture from the nanny. The twins were at the park, covered in ice cream, laughing. Elena stared at the photo, her heart swelling. This was the real victory. Not the building, not the foundation, not even the justice served on Richard. It was the peace, the simple, boring, beautiful peace of a Tuesday afternoon without fear. She texted back a heart emoji and closed her phone. She had won the war, and now she was going to enjoy the peace. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They are the ones watching, waiting, and preparing. Richard Sterling learned that lesson too late. He thought he was playing chess against a novice, only to realize he was sitting across from a grandmaster who had already seen checkmate 10 moves ago. Justice wasn't just served. It was delivered by hand, in a blue folder, by a mother who knew exactly what her daughter was worth. Was this justice enough for Richard? Should he have lost more than just his money and freedom? Or did Elena show too much mercy? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dramatic tales of power, betrayal, and redemption.